Hey guys, welcome to the final video for your little period where I'm actually away. This is on Roman Tactica and Strategy. Okay, so the first thing we're going to draw your attention to is a nice little chart that I feel sums it up very well. There are several of these deployment variations that the Roman legions would use. So over on the left you'll see there's a wedge formation where it was a small point that was intended to break through the enemy because this would allow the people behind them to start coming in and overlapping them. It would make the use of the barbarian long swords quite ineffective because they didn't actually have room to swing, whereas the Roman short sword would be much more effective due to its ability to just bash him with the shield than stab. Now if we'll have a look at moving on to the next one, single line defense. This is quite common of many infantries. The reason I wanted to bring your attention to this is because I'm hoping the mouse is showing up, but if it's not, you have to listen to my description. The way that this would effectively be quite an effective way to defend against cavalry. Now, they would charge into the enemy, and what would tend to happen would be the hastati and the principes would present their pilum in front of their shield, so all you've really got is a line of spiky shields. Now, cavalry horses and that will not charge into that, and when they stop, the second line starts doing some damage with their spears. Now the third one that I'd like to draw your attention to, and these aren't the only ones, these are just some of the examples we're going to, is the maniple channels formation, or the manipular formation. Now this one was actually quite common of the ancient times, probably not with these deep channels. If you have a look at those black arrows, they probably pointing down those channels, probably not quite as often, and if you can read you'll see this is designed to defend against elephants, but it would have the velites, or velites, I apologize, in the front line, and these guys would just pelt the enemy with spears. In fact, we'll move on to that, but they would pelt the enemy with spears after spear, so that their shields were useless and a couple of them might have died. Now these guys were not well equipped. They would have had a gladius, almost rags. If we look at the picture, we can see that he's basically gone and killed his dog to give him a little bit of extra armor. That's the sort of thing we're looking at. They may have even have had a shield if they were lucky. There was also the Rori, which were the poorest of the poor. These guys, they'd have been lucky if they had stones. And we're moving on to the hastati and principes. So now I've only got one image for them, but because they were effectively the same thing. The hastati were a little bit poorer than the principes. They were originally equipped with a hasta, which is where the term hastati comes from, and light armor. Eventually this was changed to a gladius, and as you can see, he's taking up the regular stance with his shield in the front and his gladius behind, ready to stab and repeat. They would have been equipped with the galea, and these guys were the light infantry. These were sent in ahead of the principes. The principes were basically, these guys would become the legionnaires that you're accustomed seeing, you know, your fellows equipped with the segmentata. These guys were quite wealthy, and that's an interesting point to make about the Roman army. You are divided into the group based on how wealthy you are and what armor you can afford. You're not provided with armor. What armor you provide determines where you stand. So the velites had limited armor. Your hastati and principes had a decent amount of armor. They would have had the shields, heavy armor. You would the lorica hamata, that probably would have been on the principes, full greaves, all that good stuff. Now if we move on, we'll see that we are at the triarii. Now these guys were your vets. They were the biggest, baddest guys, wealthiest, could afford the most, the oldest people, and they were the last line of defense that was relied on. In fact, there was a term which is rem ad triarius radici, which I believe translates to it's come down to the triarii, and this was to represent a desperate situation. They were equipped with the spear and the shield, and a common thing that they would do would be when they were being charged, they'd stab that spear into the ground. If you look at the bottom of the spear, you see it's got a sharp point, so that it was sticking up straight into them, and this was common to stop the cavalry charge. They would have been equipped with all the best gear, including a gladius, just in case they were engaged in close combat. The shields would have been the best, all that good stuff was equipped. And then we get to the wealthiest, the equitae, and these fellows were your knights. They were equipped with your nice round shield, because the curved shield, or the scutum, would have been ineffective on horseback. More than likely they would have used a spear or the scatha, as opposed to a shorter sword, because the scatha would give them a longer reach. And these guys were the wealthiest that they could afford. Their main purpose in battle was to flank the enemy, so while your infantry is engaging them, they would come up either side of them and engage. Now, we've also got some formations that the Romans would commonly use. Because they were fairly infantry heavy with limited amounts of archers, the archers were mainly provided by the auxiliaries. They had to find a way to defend themselves against this, and this was achieved by using a formation known as the testudo. Now, if we look at this ancient wall depiction, carving, my apologies, we'll see that if we have a look at this center piece with these square bits here, these are actually shields that are being held above and to the sides of the men as they march forward. Now, if we look up the top, they're obviously assaulting a wall. These fellows would have been throwing stones and shooting arrows down at them, and it wouldn't have been achieving much because they would just been a bouncing of the shield. Now, it may be a little bit difficult to picture this, which is why I'm a good teacher and I'm providing you with a reenactor. Honestly, if I hadn't been a teacher, I'd have been an historic reenactor. This stuff is awesome. But basically, as you can see, they had much protection because of the size of the shield, or scutum, I should say. Wouldn't have been able to shoot arrows at the front or the over the top. If they had more men, they could probably have provided shields to the side as well, making them fairly effective in fighting against people with large amounts of firepower. Now, there was also another formation that I'm particularly fond of. This was the defensive formation known as the orb. Now, it's not as effectively demonstrated here, but what you would do is you would put your infantry in a circle formation surrounding your archers and your auxiliaries. And this would large scale. It can even use small scale to the individual units. And effectively what it meant was that you could get your men to the path of the weakest and continue to fight effectively, regardless of where the enemy were compared to your position. So we'll just go through a quick summation. The Roman army was vastly maneuverable and believed in rigorous training and exercise regimes to maintain strength. And that's something that I probably should have mentioned. The Roman army, it's not just what I presented here. The strength of the Roman army was its ability to adapt to the situation. It didn't, often it would come against completely different men. There's a tale completely different fighting styles as well. There's a tale of Julius Caesar in his battle with Pompey, and he learned from the Germans a technique where the infantry, light infantry, would grab a hold of the horses' manes, and this allowed them to move even faster. So they would adapt to the situation and learn from the enemy. The main recruits were farmers from around the city, auxiliaries from surrounding towns, and from the city, population for the generals. Now, they would take farmers mainly from the city because these guys were still considered citizens, which meant they were eligible for service in the army, but they were also stronger than your city folk because they'd spent a lot of time working the plows and doing farmer stuff. Now, the army had many formations, including but not limited to the wedge, the solid line, the manipular formation, the orb, and the testudo. The Rarii were the poorest men of the legion and had limited armor and weapons. The Esseni were not trusted with anything more than slinging stones at the enemy. The Velites were poor, had limited armor, and began the engagement by pelting the enemy with javelins and pilum. The Hastati were slightly richer, had limited armor, and were considered the light infantry. They were the first to engage, and they would throw pilum into the enemy beforehand. The Principes were veterans and richer than the Hastati. If the Hastati couldn't do the job, they were sent in. The Triarii were the richest of the infantry and the best. They used long spears and shields and were last called on to sort the battle out. And finally, the equites with the cavalry of the legions were mainly used in flanking the enemy. So if you would like to take the time now to fill out your information sheets and answer the short response at the end, which I believe I should have in there, that would be great. And you should have enough time to go on and take a little bit of time to learn about Prezi and Screener, as next lesson you'll be presenting to me via Screener with a partner a short presentation that details 2 aspects, I believe, of this what you've just learned, and a quick comparison between conscription and there were 2 other points, I believe, rigorous training in the army and how an invaded party would feel. Now, you haven't learned much about this, but I just want to find out what you guys know. So take your time with it, and I want about 30 seconds of that. So just read through your next lesson, which should be posted on Edmodo. Thank you for your time, guys.